which features the internationally renowned architect David Chipperfield, who formed his architectural practice, DCA, in 1984, now has 4 offices around the world: London, Milan, Berlin, and Singapore. He has built all manner of institutions, from museums, notably his engagement with Berlin and the Neues Museum from 1997, but also palaces of justice, residential buildings, a building for the BBC, a building for the America's Cup, artist studios. He's currently completing the Kunsthaus Zurich workover, which is due to open in 2021, and the Neue National Gallery in Berlin, which is also due to open in 2021, with projects for the Met in New York City and the Nobel Center in Stockholm, among many other things in the pipeline. He was knighted for his services to architecture, and at the beginning of this year became a Companion of Honor. But last year, he was made Galician of the Year in 2020 in Northwest Spain. And he says that's actually an honor that means more to him than anything else. He currently joins us from Galicia in Northwest Spain. Welcome, David. You edited the distinguished architectural journal, Domus, a year ago, or over the last year. And when you began that process, you talked about a number of things. One was looking for community and the need to belong architecturally, or for people to belong with the buildings that were made, but also that you said it was a time to reassess. Where we are now with COVID, and after you've had that year to reassess, does it feel like we're ending an era? Does it feel like a major shift, or does it feel like business will continue as usual?
No, I think, there is a watershed here of some sort. We just don't know how profound the watershed is. I think it clearly has the potential to be a marker. If we are optimistic, it could signal a sort of motivation for us to shift in the way that we were contemplating, or at least speculating that we needed to before this happened. And we protested at that point that it was unrealistic for us to change our habits. Who was going to stop flying or going on holiday? And lo and behold, we spent 12 months demonstrating that we can indeed change our habits, albeit when that's forced upon us. But will this compound onto the pre-existing existential issues of inequality and environmental disaster? I think that, being an optimist as I am, I think this gives us a bit more of a remit to, as it were, reflect on the last 30 years, which clearly has been a period of consumption and individualism, and maybe consider that if we are really going to save the planet and look after our community in the biggest level, and those two things I believe go together, then we're going to have to reconsider growth, consumption, and community.
Is it a solution that needs to come from on high as far as planning and the commissioning of buildings and the built environment, or is it something that can genuinely come from the community?
Well, my 10 months at Domus was a sort of fascinating moment, because I tried to use, I was commissioned before COVID happened. So COVID, I started, my first issue was January, and as you well know, by March we were already sort of into the problems. So I was having to think on my feet. Funny enough, that the 10 editorial points that I had set out at the beginning, I didn't modify, because they were just as relevant, if not more relevant. But when you talk to architects, we feel slightly victimized sometimes, and we tend correctly to plead that we're at the very end of a food chain, and by the time problems get to us, most of the issues regarding environment or society have already been predetermined. We're designing out something that's already been predefined. So we as a group counter to where we might have been sitting in the 1960s, let's say, where we were designing new towns, universities, and we were very much engaged in planning. We are now much more in the process of realization of market requirements. And so we found ourselves disempowered. So we were in this paradoxical situation that the business that we're in, building our built environment, is probably one of the most profound contributors to environmental issues. And yet, on a one-by-one basis, we'd all put up our hands and say, yeah, but what can we do about it? And so in that sense, we're not much different to any other human being. We're in the same issue, not knowing how we can individually contribute to systemic problems. But I think it's incumbent on us to try to take back issues. Architects like to, we're practical people. We like to do things. We don't like to spend all our time talking about what could have happened or what might happen. So we do have a profound belief that small, punctual, and inspiring, exemplary projects could, inspire and expand concepts and ideas. I think the problem is now, in our current condition, the problems are so big. We need to engage politically and most of all in planning. I mean, if we're going to have any sort of circular economy, it needs to be planned.
One of the features, one of the themes of this whole summit around the cultural economy and the economy of culture is the role of institutions. Now, I'm sitting here in a John Pawson redesigned landmark building, and I'm very proud of it in London. And that's a reason to get people to come here. But it's only the blank canvas on which I want to program. And that also should be the driver of why people visit. When you've worked in very sensitive and very expansive ways in a number of institutions. I mean, in Berlin, as I said, almost an excavation of the Neues Museum, recently restoring Mies van der Rohe's Neue National Gallery. But you've also built your own, let's call them landmarks, museums in Mexico or in Wakefield or in Margate in England. The business model for museums, we say it needs to change, but we still need attractive buildings that we can sell to audiences who we need to get to come. Can we break that cycle? I mean, I'm trying to be more local here, but I know I still need the audiences who are going to be coming to London, both nationally and internationally. And that's a problem in the future because the business model is so dependent on that.
Well, the question you're asking is, what role does architecture play in branding and advertising cultural institution? And that's put as starkly as that. It's a very uncomfortable question because I don't think architects would ever like to think that what they've designed is not profoundly responding to a task, and the task is more than just being an image in a color supplement. But that has been in the economy and our sort of mediated world of the last 30 or 40 years. One has to say that the profile of museums, connecting that to tourism, connecting that to the desires of cities, whether that's Barcelona or Bilbao or wherever, to, as it were, use cultural institutions to promote their attractiveness as a destination. I mean, that clearly has been a convenient marriage, so convenient that we now have cities rethinking that because tourism has shifted, in my opinion, well, in lots of people's opinion, in the last 10 years, from something that was seen to be only good into something which is seen to be carrying a lot of potential harm. And you don't only have to be in Venice or Barcelona to see that. So I think the notion, I mean, and in my experience, the museums that have most confidence in their collections and their program and their social position are the ones least anxious about image. I mean, Kunsthaus Zurich has such an extraordinary collection. Art in Switzerland, especially in Zurich, is unquestionably important. Therefore, the building just has to do what it does well. In Wakefield, maybe to get people to come, I mean, maybe Wakefield was the most sort of image conscious of our buildings. In a fairly wasteland site, in a city that isn't naturally waiting, well, first of all, doesn't have a real collection, and secondly, isn't necessarily got the real audience yet, then maybe the architecture has to play a stronger role in that place, and that's undeniable. And obviously, Bilbao is the symbol that started, in a way, the project that began this whole realization of destination, image, cultural institution. I think this is a dangerous mix if you're not careful. Wakefield, for me, is a very interesting balance, because while that project was certainly considered by the city as a potential regeneration project, our warning at the beginning was to say, don't build a museum just because you want to regenerate. Build a museum because you want a museum, because you're going to have to look after it. You know, it's like having a dog for Christmas. You know, you're stuck with it afterwards. So don't just, you know, do it as a piece of self-gratification. But I think what's fantastic about Wakefield, I'd like to take my office would like to take some credit for the architecture, but I would have to say their programming, their outreach, the way that they've, as it were, invented their audience or caressed their audience has been fantastic, and really, you know, I would say much more important than the architecture.
So is that what we mean by participation and community and collaboration in museums, where there's been a proper consultation with the curatorial staff in order to try and forge the kind of spaces that will enable them to become the institution they want to become, rather than this being something that you ask the entire population of Wakefield to consult with you as to what kind of building they want? Wakefield, by the way, for those listening in from around the world, is in West Yorkshire, near the birthplace of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, but it's a kind of exemplary building that David Chipperfield and his studio built in the town. Anyway, carry on. Sorry, answer the question. Apologies.
And it'd be places such as Mexico, Wakefield. I mean, that's an unusual sequence of geographic places. I'm not sure whether curators and directors necessarily know exactly what they, you know, I mean, because don't forget, you guys are sitting in a chair for a short time, and you might have very strong opinions, but the director that replaces you might have very different ones. So as architects, we have to be a little bit independent of you guys as well. So we have to think about, you know, we have a lasting client, which is not necessarily the ones only sitting around the table.
So who are you? Who are you consulting with then?
Well, I think there's two different things here. One is the relationship to the community, and the other is the performance of the building itself. And of course, when those two things work, they work in collaboration. I think that Wakefield is a museum that, as it were, receives people very well. There's a tour, so and it holds art very well, and it has light. So there is a physical thing as well as a social thing. But I think as you know, this is the challenge for architects. That the thing which drives us most is making those beautiful spaces, making the staircase, making the beautiful concrete wall that sits in the water, or the window from which you can see the skyline. This is our physical craft. This is what gets us up in the morning. This is what we love to work with. But at the same time, this stuff has to be towards a purpose. And that purpose is ideally collective and social. So therefore, it has to play a role in its community. And at the same time, increasingly, we have to be very considerate of environmental consequence. So we have this little triangle of responsibilities, which is community, environment, and the physical. And we can't really leave any of those out anymore. It's no good only, not being interested in the physical qualities of architecture, because then in the case of a museum, no one would come. But these are the issues that our craft as architect, or our profession as architect, have to increasingly consider. And therefore, in the case of a museum, for instance, how can a museum bring people across the threshold? Or how can you help directors like you get more people across the threshold, not just the people who would normally come across the threshold? How would you get people who would normally think that a museum is not for them? That's a very fascinating thing. How can we help you guys, as it were, develop your outreach? Because that, if we are not to rely only on tourism as a way of stimulating visitor numbers, then we have to find ways of appealing to a larger proportion of the local audience. And that's through outreach, through education, through different types of programs.
And that's content, as you say, because build a good building and the potential is many will come, but you still probably have to outreach to local communities who often feel that buildings are built for people out there, not for them. And so that is in outreach. You've talked in the past, so I want to sort of skate over it, but that Berlin, fraught as all cities are, does things well in the sense that there's consultation. Sometimes it's sort of quite confrontational with the public, but you have to go through all those processes at the beginning of the Neues Museum project, and that's kind of healthy. And Berlin often seems to emerge as a model in conversations. Tatiana Bilbao, an architect who I know was talking about the tenants collectively trying to determine what their specific housing might be in the future. But I want to, if I can just skip on to looking at something hyper local that may or may not have ramifications for a more universal application, or there may be lessons to be learned. And that is this foundation that you've been instrumental in setting up in Galicia, where you are now, the Fundación Ryerai. Do you want to just explain what that is and how that operates? Because it has this supremely local aspect to it, but it is consultative, and it's been something that I'm very struck by what might happen if others did the same.
Well, I suppose it's an accident, because I've been coming to this region for 30 years, and in a way, it's payback time. But it's also a professional impulse. Going back to the first things we discussed is, what is the role of an architect? And over the last 30 years, I would say we've been extracted from a sort of embedded position as respected and regarded professional advisors and molders of our built environment. We somehow lost that respect, I think, through the 60s and 70s and bad planning things that were done in the 70s and 80s. And now the star architects are not the ones that are necessarily building social housing or university campuses or doing planning projects, but doing the one-off, noticeable and glamorous projects. I mean, and I'm one of them. Museums, of course, do have some foothold in societal contribution. So one can feel grateful to be involved in museums in that level. But if we try from our studio to make more contribution, it's very difficult to do that with projects that are necessarily given to us, where we are designing an office building or designing even a museum. And I'm very committed to the fact that practice has to change. And this is what my manifesto was during Domus, was that We have to become much more interested in practice and products. We've become a product-based profession, producing nice, shiny objects for our consumerist world in one way or another. And now I think all of us, designers, architects, and planners, have to become much more engaged and embedded. That's very difficult in a society that doesn't have that infrastructure anymore. Now in Galicia, there is very little planning happening. And I've been able over the last 5 or 6 years to put down my architectural guns, as it were, to say that I'm not really interested in being a sort of designing one-off buildings. But what I am interested in doing is being an agency, considering how the built and natural environment is determined. And therefore, I'm mediating with the regional government, the local administrations, the commercial sector, the local residents, and our little foundation has spent 5 years, as it were, trying to draw these things together in the zone where no one takes responsibility. So, as an example, little towns which are very charming are now cut in half by roads. These roads used to be the street where people used to meet. Now they're roads where people drive 60 kilometers an hour and people can't cross them. So we have tried to insist that these roads become streets again. Now, the traffic planners say, well, that's not our problem. The urbanists say, well, that's not our problem. So whose problem is it? How can an old lady not cross it? I mean, so we're saying it doesn't matter that it's administered by the transport department. The fact is, when a road goes through a village, it's a street, and therefore it's part of the built environment, not just traffic distribution. Now, all of those things fall through gaps. And so if we are to talk about linking things together environmentally, in terms of community, quality of life, quality of environment, then we have to find guardianship for this somehow. And I think our profession, I mean, if we can't step up, who can? So this is the experiment that we're doing here, and we're in a very benign environment. Galicia and the administration here is very receptive to what we do. They support everything we're doing. So is the university. So I would probably find this difficult to do in London or anywhere else. So that's what this experiment is about.
I was going to ask you, could you scale it up? But it's to do with the bureaucracies and governmental structures and the political will in places, is it? That's the main obstacle to overcome.
It's political will and the willingness to intervene. And of course, you're being in Brexit England, you know that one of the issues about the Anglo-Saxon world is that we believe that the market tells you what to do, and we're very reluctant to intervene. Except we've now seen in the last year, the one thing we need to do is intervene continuously. I mean, once our lives are threatened, all of a sudden, it's amazing how much intervention you realize you need to do to keep people healthy, to keep them in work, to subsidize their situation, and to maintain a quality of life. Now, what happens when we get rid of this horrible virus? We go back to our old ways and say, well, you're all on your own again now. Or do we all really acknowledge that quality of life is not money? And that's the other aspect of what we're trying to do in Galicia. Galicia is regarded as one of the poor areas of Spain. And I would argue it has one of the highest qualities of life. Now, if we can, going forward, all of us understand that the pursuit of individual wealth, of destructing social infrastructure does not give us a quality of life, but actually how we live, how we get up in the morning. People like you and me are privileged. We get up in the morning, we have a nice place to have a coffee in the morning, we look out of our window on a nice street, we take our kids down the street to a nice school. That is not available for a huge part of society. And that society we've left behind. And we've left it behind in England as much as anywhere else.
Does that mean that, you said earlier, I thought with a certain honesty, that star architects often build landmarks, and you've done that. But I suppose what you didn't say was that with that maybe comes leverage to lead or to shift emphasis. You clearly have leverage in Galicia with this foundation. Do you think that major architects, the internationally renowned architects, have the leverage and responsibility to try and lead planning, to try and sell those ideas to government?
Yes, absolutely. And that's the paradox at the moment, is that after my period in Domus, I'm very heartened and optimistic to see a younger generation, both designers and architects and planners, who are really engaged and really want to shift the priorities of our profession. The difficulty is they haven't got that much experience and they haven't got much leverage. At the other end of the food chain, at my end, you have a generation of architects who have leverage, but maybe they have too much to lose. So they've got the voice, and they've got to step out and be engaged. Absolutely. And I think we don't have time to mess around here. I mean, if we're going to change the way we build, the priorities for housing, I mean, do you know how many people are do not have proper shelter in Britain? I mean, it's phenomenal. And globally, and now we talk about temporary housing, refugee camps, and all sorts of things. These are not temporary. They've been going there, they've been in place for years and years and years. So this is our responsibility going ahead. And I think I'm encouraged by a young generation who is really shifting this, and I think they need help.
The impact of refugee camps and mass migration, there's a big discussion about it, which I'm very much looking forward to tomorrow as part of the summit. I'm very struck by something you said, where maybe the illustrious architects, including yourself, have much to lose. What have you got to lose? Now, if you've established your international reputation, obviously it could be like the museum model, where you just need more and more people to keep the museum going, so you can build more and more landmarks in your museum and then keep it going. We have to break that cycle. But once you've established yourself with great buildings in different parts of the world, what have you got to lose? What's the fear? That you do a bad building and your reputation plummets?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think you've got anything to lose, except it's not that easy to do it. You're basically, you've got to saw the legs off the chair that you're sitting on. And that's quite difficult, because in a sense, we operate machines which are in a way successful at what they've learned to do over the last 30 or 40 years. And now, in a sense, we've got to think about how we can turn these chairs, and we've got to turn them quickly. I mean, that's the difficulty, but that's our chance. That in terms of environmental issues, this is not a sort of slow, gradual shift we need to make. We need a violent shift in our concentration and our emphasis. And that doesn't happen. It's not something we're going to do over 2 or 3 generations. We're talking about the next 10 years. These are critical 10 years. And so those of us who are privileged, as you'd say, have some sort of leverage, have to think about how to use it.
You say you're heartened by an emerging generation of architects, planners, designers. Very briefly, the time we've got left, what about the teaching of architecture? What about your experience of architectural schools now? Because that is obviously critical. Do you think, broadly speaking, they're approaching the teaching and training of architects and designers in the right way?
No. And in fact, it's a conversation I'm having here in the school of La Coruña. There's a lot of frustration. And if you go to a small community like this, the architects in the School of Architecture are totally frustrated. They think that the politicians are hopeless and that the opportunities for architects are terrible. So they're bitter. And then you talk to the administration and they say that the architectural schools are producing people that don't live in the real world. So you've got these two poles which don't have a way to meet. I think architectural training has to change to meet the requirements of today. We have to train our architects to think more about environment, less about imitating people like me, doing museums. That it shouldn't, our ambition as architects trained in Galicia, let's say, is not to do a tower in Singapore. It should be about protecting our environment, protecting our community, and, as it were, finding ways by which we can be agency to those things.
And are you optimistic based on your experiences in the architectural school in La Coruña, but broadly the way you see, do you think that can change? It can change. You're saying everything has to change. There's an urgency about it. Are you optimistic it will?
Absolutely. You can change. I mean, don't forget that people who are 25 are quite effective. So you could bring them up in 25 years. You can change generation. I mean, so yeah, absolutely.
On that optimistic note, David, you've made a very eloquent case for cutting the legs off your own chair, but with great candor as well. Thanks very much, David Chipperfield.
Thank you.